like to turn. Meeting has been on progress. I'll turn the mic over to Gary Hooters, and Gary will introduce our speaker.
Okay, so,
You speak up, we're having a difficult time here.
okay, can you hear me now? Check. Okay, good. Okay, so before I introduce Jim, I know most of you here, but I want to show of hands of who has served in Vietnam. Quite a few, you know, okay? And we know most all of you are pilots. Anyone here who are not, who's not a pilot? Okay, good. And, so most of you, who have served in Vietnam, probably not too many have served on the ground. How many have served on the ground? You have, okay. Okay, and Frank here definitely served on the ground in North Vietnam, pretty rare guy here. And so, Jim and I go back, maybe 20 years. We started out with our bicycle riders. How many are bicycle riders here? Okay,
Pretty impressive.
okay. So, Jim and I are in an organization called Friends of CD Link. So if you have any questions about CD Link, we're the people who can answer those questions. Oh. I'm wearing my cycling vest today in his honor. Also, I'm wearing my hat today, Vietnam veteran hat. Jim started many years ago in the Veterans Parade that we have in Palm Springs. So he started that organization the last group that marches in the parade are Vietnam veterans. And he'll explain more about that another time. So if anybody wants to walk in the parade, let us know. So we're the last group always in the parade. So Jim started after he got out of Vietnam, came back to school, went to college, he took a master's degree, and he is been 47 years in the education system here in Springs. He's a counselor for all the kids throughout all the years. So, Jim, come on up. Jim Rothblatt, and his wife Sue over here, and my wife Shirley back over here. So, Jim, come on.
So where do you, where's best? All right.
Oh, where?
I'm not wire.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right out there? If I start falling off on this, let me know. So I'm going to kind of ramble on. I was a combat medic in Vietnam. See another one over there. 1966, 1967. So I'm basically going to kind of ramble through my story. I was asked to talk about what it was like to be on the ground in Vietnam with an infantry company. So that's what I'm going to try to do. As I go along here, since I'm not used to doing this sort of thing, and it's my first talk of this sort, if you have any questions and want to interrupt me and ask a question, I'm glad for that, because that'll at least clue me in on something that I said that might be of interest. So I grew up in Southern California, and in 1965, I dropped out of college to beat the draft, so I joined the Army. That's a joke, but it's the truth. So I wound up going to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. And the first thing I learned, being from Southern California, I always thought Louisiana meant kind of a tropical part of the United States, but in November in 1965, it was friggin' cold. I'd never been so cold in my life. I cried because it was so cold. I don't even remember anything else about it except that I was cold. From there, I got moved over to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, to do my medic training. 10 weeks of training, 5 weeks of learning how to make clean bedpans, put sheets on beds, give enemas, which didn't turn out to be really helpful for the work that was in front of me. 5 weeks of it was being a field medic, where I learned how to tie a square knot and give a shot of morphine. That was the high tech as it got. I did learn how to put splints on people, which also included tying square knots. So it wasn't a whole lot of training, 5 weeks. From there, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I joined up with the 199th that was just forming. So we wound up, my next 6 months of training as a medic was all infantry training, except for dealing with blisters on guys' feet, giving shots when people got clapped. And it was 5.5 days a week of work, war games and PT and learning all infantry tactics. From there, we spent a few weeks at Fort Hattiesburg, Mississippi, wandering around in swamps and pine forests and watching out for snakes. And then we shipped out from there. They drove us on buses up to Atlanta, Georgia, loaded us on planes, civilian planes, to fly across the country. There we're sitting in these civilian planes with our web gear and our weapons. I'm looking down the aisle, seeing a guy with an M60 machine gun in his lap, and the stewardess asking him if he wants coffee or tea. It was pretty surreal. From there, they sent us to a warehouse in Oakland, and we wound up boarding on a ship. And I could start, if I can do this technology piece. Oh, by the way, when I was growing up in Southern California, I wasn't very good at school in kindergarten and first grade, so I wound up at a military academy, Southern California Military Academy, started my military career. I was there for 3 years, so there's little Sergeant Rothblatt as a 5th grader. Little did I know what was coming. Okay, here's a picture of me all happy and enjoying the adventure at Fort Benning, Georgia, when the 199th was starting up. I was all clean and life was good. That was probably on a Sunday. That was the only time that I was clean, and got to walk around the base. I'm going to talk a little bit about this guy that I met while we were at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. He turned out to be my first platoon sergeant in Vietnam, Sergeant Lucian T. Brewer, a veteran of World War II, Korea, and had just come back from a tour of duty in Vietnam. In every war movie you've ever seen about World War II with John Wayne or Clint Eastwood or whoever, this was the guy they were modeling. When I first met him, the first day I met him, I'll tell that quick story, just because it's worth telling. We were in the barracks at Camp Shelby. We're getting ready for an inspection from our company commander, and he did some serious inspections. It was a STRAC unit. And as we're waiting for the inspection to start, the door to the barracks slams open. This guy comes in yelling, "I'm your new platoon sergeant. I could do more push-ups than any man in this platoon. And turn off that goddamn radio." And then he says, "I'm going to come by everyone. I want all of you at attention. I'm going to come by and ask you what your job is. And then we'll go from there." So he's going down the line. People are saying, "I'm a PFC, whoever. I'm a rifleman." And then he gets to me. I said, "I'm PFC Rothblatt. I'm a medic." He says, "Put some civilian clothes and meet me in the parking lot by my car." It's I think Austin Healy or something like that. I'm thinking, what? And he keeps going down the line, and I don't move because I think he's crazy, and then we're going to have an inspection. But finally, he sees I haven't moved. He screams at me across the barracks, to put on some civilian clothes and meet him in the parking lot, which I do. He comes out, he's still in his fatigues. We drive off base, go to a bar. He buys a 6-pack of beer, and we go back outside. He tells me to get in the driver's seat and drive like we're not going to live to see tomorrow. It's this guy I'm talking about. As I'm driving down this little country road in Mississippi, he pops a couple of beers open and hands me one. And I'm going 105 miles an hour. The car is missing. It's not, and I'm tall. If you noticed, I'm 6'5", and I got the steering wheel pressed against my thighs, so I don't have good control of this thing. And he's telling me all about his service. He doesn't do well in peacetime. He's been busted as low as an E2, and he's been promoted as high as an E9. And that he's done one tour in Vietnam. He doesn't understand how a man could survive 2 tours, and one of us isn't coming home. So I was pretty excited to hear that. And he also tells me that I'm never to be more than 10 meters away from him without his permission. So anyway, moving along. This is the company I was assigned to. It's Charlie Company, 4th of the 12th, 199th Infantry Brigade, light infantry. So our main mode of transportation was our feet and what we could carry on our back. Second to that were choppers. We were an air mobile unit. And we did move around some on boats from time to time. In fact, this is the boat that took us to Vietnam. I was on that thing for 3 weeks. And I can tell you one thing I learned real quick about that is the Pacific Ocean is big. It's 21 days, 24/7 to get across the ocean. It was a sleeping quarters for us. And we got to Vietnam, and Gary thought I should put this in because I'm talking to a bunch of aviators, but I know most of you guys are probably fixed wing. But the sound of Hueys was constant. I don't know that there was ever a day that went by we didn't hear Hueys flying around somewhere. They took us where we were going. They brought us everything we needed, and they also medevaced as needed. This is a terrain that I operated in. It was in War Zone C. It was a Delta area, north and east of Saigon. It was like being in the Brownwater Navy without the boats. It was rice paddies all over the place, cut by streams and canals and rivers. And along each of the rivers and streams were these palm-like deals. They're called nipa palm. So we mostly, my first few months in the field were in jungle, and I was in the field for 8 months, and the next 7 months were mostly rice paddies with sprinkles of jungle. So it was basically mud and wet and filth, and I'll kind of talk about that as we go along. In terms of what it was like to be on the ground, it was exhausting. It was mostly patrols by day. Sometimes if we had perimeters set up, we'd get this, be in a foxhole on the perimeter for a night or two. So patrols during the day, ambush patrols by night, never more than 4 hours sleep because you were either on I was a medic, so I wasn't necessarily on watch other than radio watch that I shared with the RTOs or radio telephone operators. But 4 hours sleep was like max. And so it was hard physical labor every day. I expected in the 8 months I was out there that I had an opportunity to take 8 showers. So it was generally go 3 to 4 weeks between showers. I don't know if that was the same for you. But the good news is you can't smell anyone else over yourself. So, and you can't get any dirtier than we were. This is a picture of me early on in a pagoda. I kind of like this photo of myself, kind of old world selfie. I call it the rifle and the Buddha. So this was we arrived in Vietnam on December 6th, I believe. And we filled sandbags and straightened up the tents in our base camp, which was just being built, for about 3 or 4 or 5 days. And then we went on our first patrol, which was in jungle. And we were out in jungle for about 2 or 3 weeks. I think it was just, and we made no contact at all that time. It would have been a walk in the sun, but we didn't see much sun being in the jungle and all. But we took our first casualties. And the first casualty, we had this gung-ho squad leader, I believe, he's with one of the other platoons. I was in second platoon. The company had 3 rifle platoons and 1 mortar platoon. I was in second platoon, which was one of the rifle platoons. But anyway, while we were in the jungle in one of the platoons, this one squad leader made his own manual ambush. He basically set up a hand grenade, like with the tripwire, which isn't something we normally did or ever did, actually. But he decided to do that. And at first light in the morning, he tried to dismantle it and blew both his arms off. And 2 other guys were wounded. One seriously was wounded by the ring off this sergeant's finger, never to be seen again. It was first light, and we're still all brand new and kind of working out what's going on. And I'm sitting with my platoon leader, Sergeant Brewer, who you've met, and the RTOs. And over the radio, we hear this guy screaming, "Get the medic up here quick." I mean, he's screaming in a panic. "Get the medic up here quick. Sergeant Missardino just had his arms blown off." And Sergeant Brewer, without missing a beat, as cool as a cucumber, says, "He'll never be able to wipe his ass again." So I tell that story just to give you a clue about Sergeant Lucian T. Brewer and this Sergeant Missardino that just had his arms blown off. You can read about him in Stolen Valor, because the guy, it wasn't enough that he got his arms blown off in Vietnam, but after he got home, he lied about how it happened and said that it was some CIA operation that he was in and that he was wounded in combat. Just an interesting aside that I thought I would share since I'm telling my story. Most of the operations, or all of the operations I was on, were small unit operations. As I said, it was north and east of Vietnam. And so except for one occasion, all the contacts we made were with Viet Cong. So, which were pretty short firefights. This was our man that was first killed in Vietnam. Remember, we arrived in January. He was our first death. He was out of my platoon. Got it, William Strawn. Where am I here? This is a picture of him. He was killed going out on an ambush patrol. Piece of shrapnel from a grenade hit him in the throat, and he choked to death on his own blood. I should have been there. I wasn't. He would have been my first death that I experienced. He wouldn't have been my first casualty. I always felt guilty that I wasn't there, and it wasn't my fault that I wasn't there because I got bumped by supplies on a Huey that was taking us out to the field. My first casualty was before this, my first serious casualty, because I didn't know. I really wasn't cut out to be a medic. I could barely watch the films they showed us in medic training. They're trying to desensitize us. I don't know if it was the same for you over there, but they'd show us the gory films from Korea, World War II, few from Vietnam. They'd show the wound, then they'd show the operation that it took afterwards to fix it. And the guys would get up and walk out of the room while they were showing these films. I didn't have to do that. I watched them like this. So I wasn't tested. You know, it was 6 months of blisters and that sort of thing pre-Vietnam, but I didn't know how I was going to do. And I wanted to be able to do my job, but I didn't know if I could. So my first casualty, we were going out on patrol, and I watched a man about 20 meters in front of me step on a mine called the toe popper. Blew him up into the air, about 6 feet, threw him into a bush. He was screaming, "My God, somebody help me." I got up to him, and his left foot was still in his boot, but it was just attached to his leg by just a scrap of skin, kind of flopping around. His left hand was messed up. His left thigh was messed up. I shot him up, put a tourniquet on him, I bandaged him, shot him up with some morphine. And the morphine didn't seem to do any good. I hit him up with a second shot of morphine. That seemed to work. That became my 2 shots of morphine became my deal. Anyway, so I was in such shock, I was able to do my job. So I felt better about myself, but not about what was to come. This was, man, the first death that I experienced. Been a bad day. It was February 5th, 1967. We were on patrol. One of the other platoons just got hit by a claymore mine, wounded 9 guys. That was the most casualties at one time we'd taken at that time. We were had been blowing enemy bunkers we were finding all day, but they were empty. Luckily, we'd been shot at all day, but no one was getting hit. And finally, it's getting dark, and we're heading back to the perimeter that we had set up. And last man, we took some sniper fire, and then there was a lot of return fire. I was at the end of the column. This man was the last man in the column. And I heard through all this noise and all this fire, someone saying, help me, I'm hurt." And I looked down from this berm we were on into a ditch of water, and there was a helmet struggling to stay above the water. And I jumped down in the water and lifted this guy up. And it was all I could do to hold him up with all his gear. And at the end of the column, it was just me and him. And there was a photographer that had joined us that day that was up on the berm, standing behind a palm tree with his camera looking down at me, holding this guy, snapping my picture. And the fire's still going on. So I start screaming at this photographer to help me get him up onto the berm. He wouldn't do it. Finally, some guys come in, lift him up, and strip him naked. Finally found out where he shot, and he died on the berm with I'd given him up mouth to mouth. We had a pharyngeal airway, so he died with my air in his lungs. He's the only man that died, the ones that you're going to meet today, that I didn't know. He had just joined our platoon. He was with us about 5 days. I never even said hello to the guy, and I was with him when he died with my air in his lungs. So moving on. That's a picture of him. I mean, that guy doesn't look old enough to even wear the uniform. He was from San Diego. His name's on, there's a little memorial of the North Coast, San Diego, with his name on it. This is the second guy that I was with when he died, James Berard. I knew him well. We were on a full company sweep. That was unusual for us to be the whole company instead of just a platoon. So we're sweeping across these rice paddies with a kind of a V formation with 1st and 3rd platoon walking on line, and they're reconning by fire into these nipa palm stands like I showed you a picture of earlier. And every time they fired, every time they opened up for this reconning by fire, my platoon would take fire. And so we thought they were shooting in our direction somehow. So we were on the horn, on the radio saying, "Cease fire, cease fire." And they'd stop and fire would stop. We'd get up and move on. They'd recon by fire again. We'd take fire. It happened 2 or 3 times. And then finally, we walk into, just like that picture I showed you earlier, crossing that stream. The point man and the guys behind him walked up to 3 VC that were in a hole at the stream. And they opened up, they wounded the point man, and they shot Berard here. When I got up to Berard, the point man was buried in mud up to his thighs. firing his M16 with one hand, screaming, I got him, I got him. Can you see him? Can you see him? And he threw his weapon down into the mud because he emptied the magazine, but he couldn't change the magazine because he'd been wounded in the arm. And then he did something that's impossible to do. Anybody that knows anything about grenades knows you can't pull a pin out of a grenade with your teeth. I've read it. They used to do it in some of those old war movies, and I would believe it, except I watch this guy, Ken Spence, doing it. Sometimes when you're desperate, because there's like a cotter pin that's crimped, and you got to uncrimp the pin to pull the pin out. But old Ken Spence was pulling that pins out of his grenades and throwing them into the stream, pulling the pins with his teeth. When I got to Berard, he was still alive. He was strapped up with all his M60 machine gun ammo because he was an ammo bearer for the machine gunner. And as I was taking the ammo belts off him, and I lifted his arm to try to find out where he was hit, he cried out in pain and died. And I've always felt, did I kill him? Did I not get that stuff off him right? Anyway, there's another guy, a machine gunner, by the name of Daniel Toro Vasquez, a Puerto Rican that speaks almost no English, living in Puerto Rico, that feels that he killed Berard with friendly fire. And he's been tormented by it his whole life ever since. The guys that were with Berard up front say it wasn't the friendly fire that killed him, but that's not good enough for Toro. He still believes he did it. That's a picture of Berard. I've been in touch with his sister. This is me bandaging Ken Spence. Ken Spence was shot in the left arm. After 2 shots of morphine, he thought it was a good idea for someone to take the camera out of his pack and get a picture of us. That's what morphine can do, even if you're shot. This is minutes after, and Berard's laying there waiting to be evac just out of the frame of this camera. There's a picture of Ken Spence that I met at a reunion some years ago, me and Ken Spence. He's a mule skinner in Eastern Oregon. I wanted to show you this because I know there's some officers in the room. I've got a picture of officers' quarters. This is myself in one of the RTOs building the officers' quarter for 2nd Platoon at one of the perimeters that we're setting up. It's a nice hole in the ground. This was a particularly nice one because it had some sandbags. This one isn't so plush, but it's another one of the officers' quarters. So lieutenant, 2nd lieutenant to become 1st lieutenant, slept in a hole just like the rest of us. And there I am posing with the new M16 that the lieutenant just got that day. It was one of the smaller ones. I guess they needed a cuter one than the rest of us carried. This is me and one of the RTOs the morning after what we call the search and seal. Sometimes what we would do, we would be the boogeyman. With some of these small villages, we would go out in the middle of the night, the darkened night, and circle a village. And in the morning, I don't know who the headquarters or whoever would come with ARVN soldiers, Army of Republic of Vietnam, and they interrogate everyone in the village looking for draft dodgers, Vietnamese draft dodgers, and Viet Cong. So this is us first morning sitting on one of the Jeeps that brought the people in. I don't know why they called it search and seal, because it should have been seal and search, but you know, it's the military. The only life that I think I saved as a medic was actually going out on one of these search and seals. It was middle of the night. We're going through water. It was almost waist deep. So dark, you have to put your hand on the shoulder of the guy in front of you so that you don't lose contact. And somehow I noticed a helmet bobbing above the water off to our right. Second time I've seen the helmet. So I went over and I reached underneath and I pulled up a an RTO that had stumbled and fell and in the water, and with the weight of his back, he couldn't get up. So pulling this guy up, I do believe that I saved his life. I'm not sure any of the bandages I ever put on anyone saved their life. It was the quick trips and Hueys that got him to medical attention that saved lives. Thank you, Huey pilots. This is having a good time, supplementing some sea rations in the field. We killed a Viet Cong chicken and we're cooking it up. It wasn't easy cooking that chicken because it was a rainy day, but we managed to cook it up and it was really good. What happened though was one of the village women came and went right into our perimeter, screaming at the company commander that we stole her chicken. So that guy on the left there wearing the beret wound up having to pay for it. He's not the one that killed the chicken, but he did have some to eat. Company commander put out an order that no one was to steal any more chickens. So we enjoyed that chicken so much. The next day we went out and got another chicken. And if the company commander caught us, the line was we were going to tell him it was a duck. This is me. We worked with Arvin Rangers from time to time, company to company, and so that's me with my Arvin counterpart, the medic. He took that picture and wound up giving it to me. I always wondered what happened to him. He was a really nice young man.
What is Arvin?
Arvin is Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And just a short aside, in the year 2000, I went back to Vietnam with my daughter for a visit. And every day that I was there, I guess I stood out because I'm 6'5" and I'm Caucasian. And men our age would come up and say, hello. And I'd say hello back and they'd go, oh, you speak English. And I'd go, yes. And they'd say, where are you from? And I'd say either California or America. And they'd say something like, have you been here before? And when I'd say yes, the conversations would start. It was like a welcome home in Vietnam, of all places. And they'd sit down, they'd want to buy me coffee, they'd want to buy me tea, and we'd sit there and drink and they'd talk. And sometimes they even bought me Russian vodka. And it was remarkable. I was there 8 days, and that repeated itself every day for 8 days. That it was in the south part of Vietnam, but it was an amazing experience. This is me after I was there a little while. I was getting worn down and I could see it. And that was not a good moment. I don't know who took my photo, but they gave me the picture of myself. I guess they didn't want it, but it kind of reminds me of what it felt like. Because as I said, it was grueling. It was physically exhausting with not enough sleep and not as much food as you need eating sea rats pretty much every day. Though we did get sometimes warm meals and sent out by Hueys in Mermite containers. And most of the time, they weren't hot meals. They called them hot meals, but if they were lukewarm, that was good enough. And I actually hated them during the monsoons because they'd give you paper plates. And there's nothing like eating mashed potatoes off a paper plate in a monsoon rain. Make sea rations look really good. I sprained my ankle while I was there. As close as I came to getting wounded, jumping off the back of a 1.5 deuce as we went back into base camp. And the reason I have this picture and tell this story, because it's another one of my stories, jumped off the back of this 1.5 deuce. If you've ever been on or off a 1.5 deuce, is when the tailgate's down, there's a little loop that you step up on. Well, I nicked that as I jumped off the 1.5 deuce. I nicked it with my heel and landed on my toe and sprained my ankle. And it was a bad sprain. My ankle immediately swelled up. I couldn't put any weight on it at all. So they loaded me into a Jeep and took me to the 25th Medevac hospital. And as I got to the hospital, there were Hueys coming in, offloading wounded GIs. Just Huey after Huey. And all these GIs on litters or bloody and mangled bodies. I don't know what unit they were with or what was going on or where they came from. So I'm hopping into this hospital while these hospital medics are running these guys in their litters into this room. Big room, way bigger than this. They had like sawhorses set up, and they're putting these litters up on the sawhorses, and there's teams working around all these guys. It was like frenzied activity, and I'm hopping through there. They guide me back to this other room. So I figure it'll be days before they see me about my little old sprained ankle. The surprise was I get into this room, they sit me down, a doctor comes out, looks at my ankle, says it looks like it's broken. They sent me the x-ray, they x-rayed my ankle, sent me back to that little room. Doctor comes out, says it's not sprained. They write me up, wrap me up. They tell me write me a report for light duty for 3 weeks. And I'm out of there, and as I walk out, they're still working on those guys in that front room that I just went through, where they triaging. The kind of care and immediate care that they were giving those guys and me with a puny ass little sprained ankle was remarkable. I'll never forget it. This is the next guy, Mike Molina. He's from Southern California, died on February 28th. It's a picture of him. He wasn't in my platoon. I knew him. I knew all the guys that you're going to meet here because we trained together for 6 months at Fort Benning. So even though we weren't necessarily in the same platoon, we all got to know each other. Mike Molina died going out on an ambush patrol. A claymore went off, blew him into 3 pieces. They never found one of his legs in the dark. It's still over there in Vietnam somewhere. This is March 3rd. This is a guy by the name of Talon. It's a red-headed guy. After our first few months in the field, he came to me crying. And I don't know why he came to me. It was weird. As a medic, I had guys coming to me and telling me their life story and stuff like I was some sort of counselor or something. But anyway, he's crying. He says he can't take it anymore. He's volunteered for permanent KP duty. And they gave it to him. And then while I was out with my sprained ankle, he comes to me and he says, I can't take the KP anymore. I know I'm going to die, but I'm going back out in the field. He was dead in days. And this is, God, I can't read it from here. Galen Moore called him Porky. Same sort of story. I was in base camp for some reason. He had just come back from R&R. And he comes up to me and he tells me he can't take this fucking army anymore. He's just re-upped. He's going to change his MOS to get out of the field. He knows if he stays out there, he's going to die. Guy was dead in a few days. I don't know why they call him Porky, because he wasn't Porky, but there he is. When he got killed by a mine. We were set up a perimeter outside a PUF unit, Popular Forces. They were Vietnamese military, but they didn't look very military. They were kind of a citizen soldier. Anyway, so it was a minefield that they'd set up. And this guy named Bland was a black man with very light skin. And it wasn't just light in color. It was like paper thin skin. And he was an RTO. And we were in water all the time. And when he'd hump the radio, his ankles would swell up from the water and the weight and all that. And he was just, I couldn't stand to walk behind him because he was in such pain. And I was always sending him in. He'd go in to see the doctor, and he'd go in. And when he got dried out, his ankles would swelling would go down, and they'd send him back out. Finally, the doctor wouldn't take him in anymore. It said he was a sham, that he was faking it. But I could tell you for sure he wasn't faking it. Anyway, Bland was clearing the field of fire in front of his position on the perimeter with a machete, and he hit the mine with a machete. And that's what killed Galen Moore, who you just saw. And I was in base camp when Bland's gear came in from the field, and it was totally bloody, and his clothes were totally shredded. And so I made the mistake of going to visit Bland in the hospital. And I got to the hospital, and I was guided to this post-op unit at the 25th of AC. And it was a big room, Quonset hut kind of thing, but it was huge. And along both walls were all these beds filled with guys just out of post-op, and they weren't even covered with sheets. And they were all, looked like they were all unconscious, probably all medicated. And all these zippered bodies, I mean, sutures everywhere. It was like the worst horror scene out of a Halloween kind of deal you've ever seen. And in the middle of the aisle was Bland with both his legs up in traction. And he was unconscious also. And the nurse that was attending him told me it would be 11 or 12 months before they even knew if they could save his legs. I always wondered if they were able to save his legs, but I doubt it after looking at what his pants look like. And this is April 23rd, just passed. It was an anniversary date. This is the one date that we came up against what I was told were NVA. It was the longest firefight I was in, which was about 6 hours. It's not none of the firefights I was in, no one ever heard about, because they were small units. I wasn't airborne ranger. I wasn't special ops. Hell, I wasn't even a Marine. I was just a straight leg grunt in a straight leg grunt outfit where half of us were probably draftees, though I had joined. So George Harrison got killed that day. It was our platoon walked into an ambush. He was the only one killed, luckily, which is amazing to me. Look at this guy. What the hell? Anyway, so he had a wound that looked pretty much like the wound that John Kennedy got. The back of his head all blown out. This was our platoon leader, our company commander at the time, Thomas Sellers. It was amazing. He was our company commander through Fort Benning, through Camp Shelby, into Vietnam, gung-ho guy. I was proud to serve under him. I was glad to serve under him. I mean, I think he was an incredible leader. So you'll see up there, he got shot that day. I had the privilege, if you can call it that, of bandaging him up. He took a shot that just missed his belly button going in, just missed his spine coming out. Looked like he had guts hanging out his back as I'm bandaging him up, and he's flopping around on the ground, wasn't cooperating with me. Platoon leader shows up, says, "Sir, I'll take over the company." And Captain Sellers says, "God damn it, I'm still in charge here. I'm not dead yet," which was amazing. It's a movie line, but I heard it myself. I was able to meet with him. This was having lunch with him some years back, Sue and I asked him about that, if he remembered saying it. And he said, "I don't cuss." But I'm goddamn sure that there was one day in his life where he said, "God damn it." Anyway, one of his RTOs was hit. 5 other guys were hit. It was a hell of a day. I saw more bravery that day among the guys in our platoon, and I saw the training that took place thanks to him. Where instead of the chaos that it could have been, I watched our platoon function just like it would have functioned in training. But by the end of that day, so many of the platoon were gone, it was never the same platoon again. But thankfully, only that one man died. One of the things I can say, and maybe my medic buddy over there can verify it, one of the things as a medic, especially, and I don't know, I went over with these people, so I knew everybody except that first guy. After a firefight, after there's people injured, the medic doing his job, you walk around with blood and flesh and sometimes brains embedded in your uniform until the next river crossing or the next rain. And so you look at yourself and you're wearing your buddies. It's fucked up. This is McElhaney. He got killed by a sniper. There he is. Looks like he should be a college student somewhere. And this is Miller, or I love this guy. Was from Motown, as he put it. He just came in a month of March, and he died here on July 2nd. This is a picture of him relaxing. Right there, it's Miller digging a 4x4 because he spoke his mind. And so if we were set up in a perimeter and you did something where you were going to get punished for some slight infraction, they'd ask you to dig a 4x4, meaning a hole 4 feet wide, 4 feet wide, and deep, and 4 feet deep, and then fill it back up. Just to remind you. So there he is. Enjoy, and it was really no problem because digging a hole is almost relaxing, but so there's guys drinking beer and shooting the shit with Miller. So just one quick Miller story. The company commander had given an order that no one in the company could have a mustache except for this one old platoon sergeant that we had. So Miller had a mustache. So Miller wasn't going to shave his mustache off. This must have been because he didn't. So the first sergeant calls him out. So we had a first sergeant. He was a big guy, 6 foot plus, built, old lifer, strack. So we see in the middle of the company, Miller is up on a hill with the first sergeant. The first sergeant standing over him like this. You couldn't hear what they were saying, but the first sergeant's giving him one of these numbers. And when he gets out, and Miller's standing with his arms folded. When he's all done, Miller's going like this. And so when Miller gets back to us, what was that all about? He said, well, the first sergeant said I had to shave my mustache off. And his answer was, this goddamn army took me away from my wife. This goddamn army took me away from my kids. But this goddamn army isn't going to take me away from my mustache. So they let him keep it. But they did make him dig a hole. But Miller used to tell me up and down, he swore up and down, there's no way he was going to die over there. He got killed by friendly fire. At the time, I was transferred to the mortar platoon, which was like a promotion because they didn't do so much patrolling. And I was made senior medic. So there was 4 platoons, 4 medics. So I was supposedly in charge of the other 3 medics, which meant if they wanted to send someone for sick call, I had to approve it. Or if they needed supplies, I would call it in for them. So I was on the perimeter when 2nd platoon, my old 2nd platoon, was out patrolling. And someone on our perimeter spotted some movement in a tree line that was between 2nd platoon and our perimeter. So the company commander called out for the 2nd platoon on the radio, and said, we're going to be firing in your direction, get everyone down. Miller didn't get the word. My friend Bernie Ford was with Miller. They had stopped. They were sitting on the ground when our perimeter opened up. And Bernie said that Miller died so fast he doesn't even know he's dead. That's another picture of Miller. Okay, next is August 1st, 1967. That's James Batten. He's with the mortar platoon. Here's a picture of Batten. We had just been with on a joint operation with the Arvins, a 3-day sweep, also known as search and destroy. And I knew I was going to be getting out of the field on August 2nd, because the medics, we were told when we went in that we'd only have to do 6 months in the field, and then we do 6 months in the rear. Well, I was out for most of 8 months, but I was told that I was coming in on the 2nd. So I was pretty happy. If I just lived through this last 3-day sweep, I was pretty much home free. So we just finished the sweep. We went out to an LZ. We were getting ready to board choppers. Our company was going to go set up a pretty solid perimeter. The monsoons were coming up again, and they were going to build a defensive perimeter, and the Arvins were going their way. So as we're getting into our boarding groups with the mortar company, or mortar platoon, the Arvins are walking by us in front of us. And Batten was kind of a guy, that guy was always smiling. He was probably the only guy that was still smiling after all that time we were in there. I mean, he could sing to himself and he'd kind of boogaloo and, you know, and so he was feeling real good that day. All of us were, because we just looked like we were going to survive and go into kind of a down spot, get some relief. And as these Arvins are walking by, in jest, Batten pushes one on the shoulder, just like this. I mean, it wasn't like a push, it was just, and he says, hurry up. The Arvin took offense to it, and he felt disrespected. I could see it in his eyes. And he threw his weapon down, and he turns to Batten, and he puts his fists up like this. Of course, the Arvin's like 5'5". Batten's about 6'3". And the Arvin looks at his fists, and he looks up at Batten, and I can tell him that he gets the idea, this is not a good idea. And so he snatches up his weapon, and he opened up at point blank range on Batten with his M1 carbine on full automatic, put 30 rounds into Batten before he could even fall onto the ground. Hit 3 other men from bullets passing through Batten's body. One of them was a friend of mine named Byron Beerbaum. And the first time it ever happened, my last day in the field, Byron is, instead of people yelling medic, Byron was yelling Rothblatt. Rothblatt, I'm hit. I went over to Byron. He had been hit 5 times, sucking chest wound. Bandaged up. As I just finished bandaging him, a Chinook landed in our LZ. Walked Byron into the Chinook. The other 2 wounded, and Batten were brought in, laid down at their feet. The Chinook took off. First time I ever had a Chinook as a medevac chopper. And the last time I had occasion to put someone on a medevac. Colonel flew out, asked me to go in and write up an incident report. So that was my last moments in the field. I was covered in Beerbaum's blood when I got back to the base camp. And I walked, and I was crying. I started crying when I got on that chopper. It was like, I don't know if it was relief or the horror or whatever, but I never cried like that before or since. I cried all the way back to the base camp. I cried as I filled out the incident report. I cried when they took me back to the medic station and the base camp. And as I walked into the medic camp, the medic's tent, one of the medics who had been with the company originally, and the medics are all around the radio in there, because you could hear on the battalion radio everything that was going on in the battalion. So they were like getting a live feed from all that was going on. So when I walked in, this one medic who had says to me, "What are you crying for? You've seen men die before." And I didn't know how to react. It was kind of, and he'd never seen a man die before in the field, and I walked out and there was concertina wire and there was a little laundry girl, Vietnamese, maybe 12 years old, standing on the other side of the concertina wire. And she's looking at me, and I think I'd stopped crying by then. And she asks me if I'm hurt, because I'm covered completely in blood. And it was so touching to hear from that little Vietnamese girl that she was concerned about me, when that dumb motherfucker medic tells me, "What are you crying for?" So these are the stories that I'm telling you, and I appreciate your listening to me, are the stuff that's been rolling around in my head for 57 years. I'm better with it now. There's no way I could have told this in front of anybody in the past, but I feel it's important. I don't know what it means. In fact, I've tried to search for some meaning out of all this stuff in all this time. And mine is just one story out of 2.8 million. I'm sure you've all got your own stories in here, but that's mine. I got a couple other slides I'll race through. This was me as an ambulance driver. Pretty kicked back. I got to take a shower anytime I wanted. And the Army being the way it was, I could just sign out the logbook. I'd say I'm taking the ambulance, no passengers, and I'm going to the motor pool. Be gone all day, hanging out with my buddies in the base camp. Come back at the end of the day, put in the logbook. I check it in at such a time, no passengers. Seemed to work, never got in trouble for it. This was my little buddy, Leonard Parachi. Many of you have seen the movie Midnight Cowboy. Remember Ratso, Dustin Hoffman's character? This is what Ratso would have looked like if he'd been drafted. He was a hairdresser from New York, little skinny guy. Wound up being my best friend my last 3 months in Vietnam, and I've stayed in touch with him. He died a year or so ago. But he was a little Ratso, hairdresser that he was. He was a killer of men. In February, when we got there, he was with Echo Company in the same battalion. He single-handedly killed the leadership of a Viet Cong battalion in our area. He shot 4 down at point blank range. He wasn't expecting the 5th to jump into the ditch that he was with. Lenny was at an ammo by the time the 5th guy jumped in, shot him 5 times at point blank range, and all of them were flesh wounds. Amazing, amazing. This is what I looked like just before I came home. If you can remember that picture of me standing next to the sign at Fort Benning, it's not the same guy. God, I'm ugly. This was a roll of honor that they put up in our battalion area. This was 8 months of deaths in our battalion. They kept a record. I don't know what that board looked like after I left, but I think they needed more boards or to get rid of the thing. This was me, my last 9 months in the Army. That was my uniform. I worked in the emergency room at Fort MacArthur Army Hospital. That's where I met my lovely wife, Susan, over there. It was actually, other than I won't even go through it. It was bad duty station. It was right next to where I lived and grew up. I had the fortune in 1975, when Saigon fell. I was a school bus driver. You'll note the school bus there. This is at El Toro Air Station, watching on TV Saigon fall, watching the North Vietnamese tank crash through the palace gates in Saigon. Before I know it, a day or so later, the bus company I was working with got chartered to go down to El Toro and pick up Vietnamese coming straight out of Vietnam down to tent city in El Toro. That was what I looked like as a bus driver. That was the guy driving these Vietnamese. I wouldn't let my kid ride on a bus with that guy as a driver. But that was an amazing experience. A quick story about that. My first bus load, I got to lead a convoy of buses with the first group that had came in from Vietnam. Got a busload of Vietnamese behind me. We weren't in school buses. We were in kind of like Greyhound buses. So I got a convoy of buses behind me. I got CHP in front of me. There were lights flashing, middle of the night on the 405 freeway heading down towards San Diego on a foggy night. And I got this Vietnamese man sitting right behind me, telling me how grateful he is to the American people for allowing them to come to our country, and that he's a doctor, and that he hopes that they can make the Americans proud of them, and that someday he hopes that he can return to Vietnam. So I'm listening to this amazing man, just so grateful, filled with gratitude and perfect English. And we get down to where the tent city is at Camp Pendleton. This Marine sergeant gets on my bus. Of course, he's standing in the stairwell next to me, and he yells out like he's a DI, "Is there anyone on this bus that speaks English?" This man that had been talking to me stands up, says, "Sir, everyone on this bus speaks English." He says, "You, translate for me." He goes, "Sir, everyone on this bus speaks English. There's no need for translation." He says, "Translate." So there it is. The good Vietnamese doctor, with all his gratitude, is now translating into Vietnamese everything that everyone already understands on the bus. Amazing, amazing. This was me. My life changed. I went to the dedication of the statues in Washington, D.C., 1984. There were 100,000 Vietnam vets in town for that dedication. I hung out at the on top of the wall, all these people in town. I'm sitting up there. At the time, I'd finished a master's degree. I was a school counselor. And I'm sitting up there watching these people come. And I spent time, 3 days and 3 nights, sitting above the 1967 panels at the wall, watching these people come up. They're below me. I'm looking down on them, and they're reaching up, pointing the names and flying. This was 84, 17 years after I served in Vietnam. And so I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, God, Rothblatt, you're a counselor and you're a Vietnam vet. Maybe you should be a veteran counselor. So that's what I did for 12 years, thanks to that visit. Part of that, I started up, was part of a chapter, local chapter of Vietnam Veterans of America. That was our group when we first formed up. For a while, we were the second largest chapter of Vietnam Veterans of America in California. Now the chapter doesn't exist at all. I used to take panels of Vietnam vets into schools, American Studies classes in May, the month coming up, to students would spend a week studying the Vietnam era, and then they'd get to ask these guys any question they wanted to ask, and the guys could choose to answer the questions or not. In this one group, just because you're aviators, this man by the name of Doty, the guy in white, he flew B-52s, which I learned at one of these panels where we had another guy that flew one of these wild weasels or whatever the heck they were called, said that Doty, he drove a garbage truck. Anyway, so that was kind of fun to hear that. And part of the working with the veterans, we did a field trip down to Little Saigon. We walked into Little Saigon supermarket. When we came out, all these Vietnamese men of age came up to us. They knew we were Vietnam vets immediately. They were all Vietnam vets themselves. And they invited us to a potluck. That was us at the potluck. And here I am with my daughter when we went back to Vietnam in the year 2000. Heard those incredible stories every day from Vietnamese. The one thing that I heard a number of times while we were there from these ex-Arvins was we Vietnamese, we had two choices. We could join the government forces and fight against our family, or we could join the Viet Cong and fight against our family. It was pretty telling. And here's where I am today, riding my bike with my friend Gary Luters, and I fly my colors on my bike. It's a 199 patch there. So I think I've used up more than my time, but thanks for bearing with me. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Oh, thanks. Did I do okay, man? You're the only one I was talking to. Is that okay?
That's fine. That's fine. I'm having a lot of trouble.